So good afternoon, everybody. This is Keith Adams from New Jersey VOAD, and I want to welcome you to our third and final summer webinar series. As you all know, those of you who have participated before and perhaps read in the notice, these are actual workshops that were originally planned to be delivered in April at our annual conference. And unfortunately, COVID threw us a little bit of a wrench. We had hoped to move it to September 9th. Yay, that was today. And of course, we could not pull that off either. So save the date, April 7th, 2021. We hope that we'll be able to pull off an in-person conference. But certainly, it has been enriching this past 2 months to be able to feature at least some of the content that we had planned for our conference. A few housekeeping notes. We ask that you please keep your Zoom or your phone on mute unless you are going to ask a question, which there'll be a time at the end that we can do that. So please respect everybody else on the call by keeping yourself on mute so that we do not hear your interesting background noises going on wherever it is that you are. The second is that just like all of our meetings and our seminar or webinar presentations, this call is being recorded. So I wanted to let you all know that up front. A couple of announcements from New Jersey VOAD. Just want to call your attention to some upcoming coordination calls. We have our food distribution and feeding call tomorrow at 11 a.m. And coming up next Monday, we skipped this week, so we're a little out of order because of the holiday, but we have our statewide biweekly coordination call on Monday at 10 a.m. And then just one final note before I move on to our speakers, and that is that we yesterday sent out a short survey asking about what your upcoming training needs and interests are for training for your organizations, what kind of programs that you would like to see New Jersey VOAD present in the upcoming year. So if you are a member or a partner or in any way connected with us, we ask that you please fill that out so that we can start to plan for next year. So now, without further ado, I am going to go forward and introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Two of the smartest people that I know, and certainly very strong partners, and New Jersey VOAD has been very enriched through its partnership and through the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance, and are proud to work with our presenters today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jeanne from the Bloustein School of Rutgers and Lisa Auermuller from the Jacques Cousteau Research Reserve. And I'm going to turn that over to you. And at the end of your presentation, we'll have a few minutes if anyone has any questions. So
thanks. Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks so much, Keith. Yeah, and we've definitely organized our presentation to leave enough time for discussion and questions at the end. So I'm Jeanne Herb. I'm at the Rutgers Bloustein School, and I'm joined by my colleague, Lisa Auermuller, who is at, as Keith said, the Jacques Cousteau National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is part of the Rutgers Cooperative Extension. And we're really so pleased to be here today and to engage in this ongoing conversation with NJ VOAD. What we know is that all Americans, all New Jerseyans are affected by changing climate conditions. But we know that there's certain populations and certain communities that are more affected. And the ability of a person to be able to withstand changing climate conditions, whether that's flooding or increased temperatures or heavy precipitation, or sea level rise that causes routine flooding during the tides. All of those things, our ability to withstand them depends on a number of different factors. And some of those factors are out of our control. So people certainly who are lower income, older New Jerseyans, children, communities of color, all the research is showing us that these populations are at greater risk than other members of the population. Some people are more vulnerable to climate risks due to social factors, such as being low income, older residents, children, communities of color. people who are have limited English proficiency, people who have compromised health, and which can worsen in climate events. Some people are more vulnerable to climate risks because of community factors, such as social isolation, which is a real struggle during disaster events. Their immigration status, in terms of their ability to access social services, limited access to food, limited access to fresh water, limited access to transportation to be able to evacuate during an event. All of these factors and the populations that NJVOAD organizations serve have really been pointed nationally as those populations that are most at risk from changing climate conditions. So before we go further, we first want to start by saying thank you to NJVOAD. Thank you for the work that you do every single day, and to all the member organizations of NJVOAD, and for keeping people and communities safe. But thank you for something specific, which is that the work that we're going to talk about today, NJVOAD had a hand in two ways. Keith served on the project working group for the project we're going to talk to you about. And I will tell you, you have a very forceful executive director who speaks his mind and gave us a lot of input on the things that we're going to talk about today. And then also second, as part of this project, we conducted a series of focus groups where we met with residents or leaders. And one of those focus groups Keith helped us organize was with NJVOAD organizations. So what we're going to talk about today, we hope, honors what we heard from you. So the second thing you're probably wondering is, why are we talking about climate change? So why are we here? Why are Lisa and I here? And that made me think about the parable of the elephant that many of you probably know, right? So 6 or 7 blind men come to see an elephant, and they're each they've been asked to explain what it is. What is an elephant? And they all approach different parts of the elephant and touch it and feel it. And one feels the tail and says it's a rope. Another feels its trunk and feels like it's a spear. So you can see from our picture that there's many different interpretations of what this this thing is, ranging from a snake to a tree to a wall to a breezy fan. And in some ways, what Lisa and I talked about is that for those of us who spend every single day working on climate change issues, we think about resilience all the time, and we come to resilience looking at it in a certain way. At the same time, we know that NJVOAD's mission is to build resilient New Jersey communities. And in some ways, you think about resilience maybe a little bit differently than we who work in the climate change world. So the reason that we're here is to come together with those different perspectives, because we believe that in the end, our collaboration between folks who work on climate change resilience and folks from NJVOAD who work to build resilient communities is a shared vision. And so we want to talk to you a little bit about what came out of this project that we conducted that we think can help bridge those different perspectives. So this was a project that we worked with the State Department of Environmental Protection and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, on. The purpose of the project was to build tools to change policy that is focused on better including underrepresented, marginalized, and vulnerable populations in climate resilience planning. Okay, so that's a little bit of a mouthful. And the couple of tasks that we took was we researched the literature, but what we did was we looked not just at the literature that we might normally focus on, like climate change literature, but we looked at in the social work literature, we looked in the public health literature to really understand how our different worlds really intersect. We also developed different sets of data that we'll talk about too, that's available to all of you now on some web-based mapping platforms that Rutgers has available to be able to identify where are there vulnerable populations in your communities. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. We developed what we call the service organization database, which probably includes many of your organizations, so that people who are working on climate resilience in their communities can find NJVOAD organizations and other organizations. We spent some time, as I mentioned, doing focus groups with residents and organizations, and spending time talking to leaders, probably some of you, who do work after disaster and with resilience. So some of the things that came out of this included a web-based training that we'll talk about a little bit more. So the training is directed to people who work in communities to do climate resilience planning. And the training is all about helping them to better understand how to engage organizations like members of NJVOAD and underrepresented populations in climate resilience planning. And then we also offered some policy recommendations to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. This will share the slide with you. It's just, this is where you can find all the products from the project. So the challenge that we were attempting to respond to is that the traditional definition of resilience in our world, our climate change, coastal hazard world, is this concept of bouncing back after an event, right? So we always talk, and even just before this, I was responding to someone saying, oh, isn't resilience about bouncing back, right? But what we heard as a result of this work, and we heard from people like Keith Adams, is that if you really want people, especially the most vulnerable populations, to bounce back from a storm, what you really need to do is to make sure that the conditions that they live in every single day, the communities that they're in, their access to safe communities, to healthy food, to transportation, to medical and healthcare officials, that all of those conditions that they can enjoy now are what make people resilient in the event of a storm, in the event of a natural disaster, in the event of changing climate conditions. And so what we came to really embrace is the concept that climate resilience is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to build communities that are healthier, more resilient, more equitable. And the opportunity is to look to share risks more equally within our communities, so that we don't identify that there are certain populations that, because of the conditions that they live in, are most vulnerable. We also came to appreciate that, and this is really why we're here today, we came to appreciate that the various worlds of resilience, the NJVOAD world, the climate change world, the health world, right, are still very siloed in practice in terms of not really moving towards an integrated, collaborative approach. And then we also learned that the concept of integrated, holistic resilience is transformative in terms of really moving towards equitable, safe, healthy, resilient communities. So these are some of the things that we heard from the engagement work that we did as part of this project. So the first is that we heard that underlying social inequities, so physical challenges in communities, economic challenges in communities, lack of access to affordable housing, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to transportation. All these factors are the biggest hurdles for the most vulnerable populations from being resilient, to being able to recover from events. The second thing we heard is that those same populations that are most vulnerable are also the same populations that are least frequently involved, that are most underrepresented in decision making with regard to how to build resilience into their communities. We learned, especially from NJVOAD folks, that there's a perception, I don't know if this is true or not, that resources to support resilience and recovery are inequitably distributed and that they tend to go to the squeaky wheel. We learned that there's a role for government to play in building resilient communities. But what we learned is that government can't operate in a vacuum. It must work with trusted sources in communities, such as NJVOAD participants. We learned that, that just finding ways to include vulnerable populations in planning efforts to build resilient communities is not enough. What we learned is that that's great and that's an important strategy, but we learned that all of us who are involved in climate resilience planning need to be considering the impact of our decisions on the most vulnerable populations. And so we need to bake in to our decision making and our policies, understanding how different decisions associated with building community resilience affect the most vulnerable populations. And that has to be a direct part of how we go about making decisions with regard to climate change resilience. And then we also heard that including vulnerable populations and underrepresented populations in resilience planning leads to communities that are more resilient for all of us. So what came out of this work is we focused, because our task here was to identify some specific strategies and actions that could be taken both at the community level, but also with regard to state policy. And so we focused in 3 areas. The first was to advance a new concept of resilience, which recognizes underlying vulnerabilities as the driving factor for certain populations being most at risk. The second is the concept of, when we're planning for resilience in communities, is to take a bigger view, is to not think, oh, let me just build a seawall, right? Or let me make sure that I can put in the floodgates. It's to look at the overall form and function, how a community works. What are the existing challenges in a community? And as part of our work to improve resilience, how can we improve those existing, those pre-existing challenges in the community? And then third, we've focused on integrating actions into protocols for climate resilience planning that engage the most vulnerable populations and underrepresented populations more, and that also offer thoughts on how to assess impacts of our decisions on the most vulnerable populations. So I'm going to talk about each 3 of those for just a minute. So in terms of the concept, the first idea of redefining resilience and changing how we think about resilience, what we propose is this concept of bouncing forward, right? So it's one thing if you live in, you know, a $1 million home on the New Jersey shore and you drive a Lexus and you shop at Whole Foods. You could say, yeah, I want to bounce back. I'd want to bounce back after an event. But if not, most of us don't live in those kinds of conditions, right? So what we want to do is move the concept to one in which, as we're building resilience strategies into communities, we want those strategies to result in communities that are healthier, greener, cleaner, more equitable, and more prosperous, and more resilient. So let's think about that as a concept when we're starting to plan for climate events. The second area that we focused on was this concept of, when we're planning to improve resilience in a community, let's not just think about, oh, I'm going to think about the wetlands. Oh, I'm going to think about emergency response. Oh, I'm going to think about the food bank. Rather, it's looking at the whole community and where there's a need to be able to address existing challenges in the community and using resilience to do that. And then third, our work really focused on, as I mentioned, taking the protocols and the methods that communities here in New Jersey and across the country are using to plan for resilience, and offering input and practical strategies on how to improve those processes by engaging the most vulnerable populations as part of planning, as well as to be able to assess the impacts of decisions, climate decisions, on vulnerable populations. So those were the three areas that we focused on in terms of what we learned from this. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeanne. So I'm going to take the baton, and Jeanne, I'm going to ask you to advance as we move forward. Just a reminder that the overall outcomes of our project included a literature review document, a good deal of stakeholder engagement. As Jeanne said, that was through focus groups and other trusted sources, key informants. The sharing of data that supports resilience. So this is social vulnerability data that we added to our NJ Flood Mapper website and to our new snapshots tool. And this, I think the data part really underscores where we took the feedback from the project working group, who had knowledge about data sets that we were unaware of and their availability. And we really listened and added the data that they knew they were using day to day in their work with underrepresented populations. We also created guidance for resilience planners and practitioners, and that's the training that Jeanne spoke about that we'll review in a minute. And then last but not least, pairing all that great underlying concepts and materials to policy options for the State Coastal Management Program to focus on. Thanks, Jeanne. So the data part, this is where all of you could go onto our publicly available websites and pull down data that gets at geographically what are the extent and the amount of social vulnerabilities and economic vulnerabilities that exist within municipalities, counties, and regions. We have been pushing our data out through our NJ Adapt platform, which is the overall platform that Rutgers has been using to share our climate change and resilience publicly available tools. So from the link, you can see where you can click on the place to get to NJ Adapt. And within NJ Adapt, you will see the NJ Flood Mapper. And this is the place where I hope many of you are already familiar with that site, but where you could actually go on, zoom into a location, pull up different social vulnerability data files, map them across your municipality, and then overlay them on top with different coastal hazards such as storm surge or sea level rise or the FEMA flood maps, and really start to be able to assess and to get a bird's eye view of where those social vulnerabilities overlap with exposure to coastal hazards within your communities. Jeanne, next slide. Another part of our work was to update our Getting to Resilience tool, which we administer through Rutgers University, and to add some more social vulnerability questions to the tool. So really getting to try to expand a municipal self-assessment process to include more factors of social vulnerability as they're considering how far along a resilience continuum they are in terms of their own work at the municipal level. And then lastly, we did create an online training for resilience practitioners to access through an NJDEP climate change website. And I'll spend the next few minutes reviewing that a little more specifically. The link to that is on the bottom of the slide as well. Jeanne, if you could go to the next slide. So the web-based training, the audience for this are people that are practitioners in helping communities to improve their resilience at the local level. So the audience is not the underrepresented populations themselves, but it really is the people that are acting in that liaison role in helping communities to improve their resilience. We've developed this site to be interactive and to move you step by step through a series of very specific concepts and modules, so that as you go through the process, you're building or scaffolding your information along the way. We've estimated it would take practitioners about 3 hours total to go through all the information if they're actually clicking on the links and downloading the information and exploring some of what we've embedded in the training. And it's certainly something where you could walk away and come back another time. The 4 modules that make up the training include understanding 6 key concepts to resilience planning while considering underrepresented populations, and we'll get into that more in a minute. And then going back to what Jeanne said, how you really can take the approach of planning for the whole community and not just one part of the community or one sector of the community. A little bit of a deeper dive into using the data to identify vulnerable populations within your municipality. And then some real important stakeholder and engagement tips that you can use as best practices for engaging populations that sometimes don't always come to the kinds of meetings that we try to host when it comes to resilience planning. Each of the modules, the 4 modules I just went over, does have a PDF or 2 or 3 that you can download as a takeaway that will kind of summarize the information in that module. And I think, Jeanne, if you click through here, it does just go through a number of the different PDF takeaway files that you as a participant would get. That again, it's like the takeaway from the overall material that the training focused on. So whether you want to pass this along to a colleague or pin it up next to your workstation as a reminder as you're working on your resilience planning, these are really meant to be summarized documents for us as practitioners to utilize as we try to engage in the training material and put it into practice in our resilience planning efforts. Next slide, Jeanne. Okay, and then finally, where the training is concerned, we thought of 5 key elements to enhance climate resilience planning, and I just want to go over them quickly. I think they reinforce what Jeanne said earlier about the whole communities concept and about it not being enough just to think about where resilience could assist vulnerable populations, but really trying to do something about it. Don't just check the box on it. So the first element to enhance climate resilience planning is to develop a social vulnerability profile. This is where we really suggest you use our mapping tools to try to really understand who's vulnerable in your municipality, what are the demographics, why are they vulnerable, and what are they vulnerable to. That goes along with the next element, which is to inventory any pre-existing challenges or conditions that might be exacerbated by a changing climate condition. So as Jeanne had said earlier in the presentation, there's a number of underlying conditions that in and of itself make someone vulnerable. You overlay climate change and increased temperature, increased rainfall, storms, and increased flooding over the top. All of those pre-existing things just work against that population in terms of being able to be resilient. We also suggest as part of resilience planning that communities really document and write a plan for how to best engage socially vulnerable populations within their municipality. And some of this is a bit of accountability. If you write it down, you're more apt to do it. But some of it is also really through the act of writing it down, you can really link that vulnerability profile to the pre-existing conditions. So what are we going to do about those things? And really link knowledge to action along the way. We also present in the training a checklist about this whole idea of it's not just enough to plan for resilience for underrepresented populations, but we really need to make sure that when we implement actions, they do take into account that not all populations start at the same starting point. One of the students Jeanne and I taught gave us this great phrase of not everybody starts up at the starting line. Some people start, way behind the starting line and have that much more to catch up to even get to the point that the rest of us are at. So this written checklist can help resilience planners understand how actions can affect vulnerable populations. Even though we may be trying to do great things by implementing climate resilience actions, we really need to go through the thought process of how will this impact vulnerable populations, and will it really impact either positively or negatively pre-existing conditions and challenges that exist in the municipality. And then lastly, we want resilience practitioners to think, for each hazard that I'm addressing in my resilience plan or my resilience strategy for my community, is there any increased risk to that hazard because I'm thinking about the underrepresented populations in my community? And if that's the case, then you really want to feature that in your resilience vulnerability assessment and draw attention to it, and make sure you have an action paired to that assessment to really put that exposure into an action and then further into implementation. Jeanne, next slide. I'm actually handing it back to you.
Okay, so I guess what I would say here is that with regard to what Lisa's talking about here, these 5 elements are new concepts in terms of community-based climate resilience planning, and they have implications both for work at the community level, but also in terms of state public policy, right? So part of our job was to take the lessons that we learned and not just develop the training that gives guidance to local planners, like this kind of guidance, on how to better address the needs of the most vulnerable populations and underrepresented populations as part of climate resilience planning. But it was also then to take those lessons and some of these same concepts and apply them, offer insights as to how these concepts should get baked into state public policy. And in a lot of ways, what I think we landed on was really to try to identify state policies as well as community-based planning strategies that more engage, quite frankly, organizations such as your own. Because part of what we heard during this project is that not only are the most vulnerable populations they don't have a seat at the table to affect decision making, but the organizations that work with them most closely, you also don't have a seat at the table. And so what we offered to try to address that second issue, how do we change decision-making processes? How do we change policy and systems so that when the state resilience efforts are providing support to communities to plan for resilience, that NJVOAD type organizations are sitting at the table and really, quite frankly, driving the agenda, because all of your organizations are in the trenches. So this is kind of where, when we first started off, I said, you know, the parable of the elephant, and we look at things differently. This is where really what our policy recommendations are, is that in order to be able to develop that shared, integrated vision between the NJVOAD vision of resilience and the climate change world vision of resilience, is to make sure that organizations such as yours have a strong voice in decision-making with regard to resilience. And so the types of public policy options that we outlined for the state fall into these 4 categories. The first is when the state's providing incentives to local governments or to community-based organizations to advance resilience. We offered recommendations there, and we'll give you some examples. The second was how to better address the needs of the most vulnerable populations as part of the state's overall efforts with regard to coastal management, right? And so the state's coastal management program does everything from protect against coastal hazards to also promoting fisheries, to promoting restoration of natural systems, right? To promoting or to have regulations regarding overdevelopment that might affect coastal resources. So the state's coastal management program does a lot of things, and dealing with coastal natural disasters is just one. And so what we attempted to do in terms of some of these policies that we offered was to have the state's program, their policies inherently focus on the most vulnerable populations, okay? The other sort of category where we offered recommendations was to recognize that for organizations that work the most closely with vulnerable populations like your own, you don't really know the world that Lisa and I know, which is the coastal management world, right? So on another version of this slide, when we talk to people who do what we do every single day, there's terms like the Section 309 process. And you guys are like, what's the Section 309 process, right? We know what that is because that's baked into the Coastal Zone Management Act. But so what we tried to do as part of some of these recommendations was to say, look, the state has a coastal program, which has dollars, which has regulations, right, which has authority in New Jersey's coastal zone. And being able to address the needs of the most vulnerable populations means that that program needs to coordinate more with programs in the State Department of Health, in the State Department of Community Affairs, in the State Department of Division of Disability Services, all these other agencies who are really mission driven, I guess, to work with the most vulnerable populations, and that there needs to be that kind of meshing of missions. And then finally, we offered recommendations, policy recommendations to the state in terms of how to have the state's overall efforts with regard to enhancing resilience, which is a priority for Governor Murphy, how to have those efforts inherently recognize that new concept of resilience, that concept of bouncing forward, rather than the historic concept of bouncing back. So in the end, what we did was we offered, we should count them, Lisa, there's probably like 30 different policy recommendations, and we're not going to go through them all now. But some of the kinds of recommendations that we offered were things like this, that for the organizations that work most closely with vulnerable populations after disasters, after climate events, those are organizations like your own that are not necessarily kind of in the bailiwick of coastal management programs. And coastal management programs need to get to know you. And so we offered the idea that if they were able to pre-arrange with organizations like NJVOAD organizations, with contracts and purchase orders and things like that, so that after events, when everything's chaos, then the state's coastal management program knows how to find you and knows how to get you some of the support that you need to do the work that you do. So that's one example. Another example is that what we suggested is that when the state offers financial incentives, grants, or anything else to locals to do resilience planning, we suggested that that should not be limited to local governments, right? It should include local governments, but it really does need to include community-based organizations that work day in and day out with the most vulnerable populations. Again, thinking of NJVOAD type organizations. And so the idea would be, yes, of course there should be support coming from local governments to do resilience planning. But we also know that it's important to have organizations like yours who are also driving and participating in efforts to build climate resilience in communities, because your organizations are the trusted organizations that work with the most vulnerable populations, and you know best what's needed. So that was another sort of series of recommendations, and I'll give you just one more example. So we also suggested, sort of falling into that third category of greater coordination with other agencies. We suggested that when the State Department of Environmental Protection, which is where the Coastal Management Program is housed, is doing work with communities, whether that's grants or technical assistance, that they really do need to be able to have a point of contact in other agencies, such as some of them I mentioned, so that as coastal managers are working to build resilience in communities, they know how they can bring in the State Department of Health, for example, because we want to be able to address health as part of resilience. Or they know how to bring in the State Department of Transportation, because we want to be able to address the fact that there are certain populations that don't have access to transportation during events. And the State Department of Environmental Protection Coastal Management Program can bring those other agencies in. Another example is, the idea that the Coastal Management Program, as it's working with communities on resilience, can bring in the State Department of Human Services to be able to make sure we're addressing the needs of populations with disabilities. And so it's sort of crossing those silos, which is always a tough thing. But we offered those as recommendations, and the outcome, the opportunity from this work are stronger, more resilient, more equitable communities overall. And so we would love at some point to walk you all through the training, but like Lisa said, that'll take 3 hours. We encourage you to fiddle through the training, and you'll all get this PowerPoint and it's got the link, to see how you can use it. And if you do use some of it, we'd love to hear from you, because we're hoping to continue this work and to work with NJVOAD organizations and others to be able to move these ideas forward. So Keith, I think we're right on time, and we're happy to take questions and offer discussion as well. So thank you.
Well, I will take over from here. Thank you both so much. We had a few questions in the chat, but if anybody else has questions, you can put them in the chat box or virtually raise your hand. If you go to the participants panel, there should be a raise hand icon. We had a couple questions come in. We wanted to remind everybody that the presentation will be available on our YouTube page, so you can find that either through the njvoa.org website, or Keith did post the link for the YouTube page in the chat box. And I think you agree that we can send out the presentation to everybody, so we'll send that out after we have posted everything. So thank you so much for that. I know someone asked about the resilience training, and if that was useful for other than coastal communities. And I know, Lisa, you commented, but did you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm super happy to report to you, Jeanne, that more than one participant has already chatted me privately about following up with us about the training. So that's exciting. That's always a good, like, oh, okay, we did okay today. We get our gold star for the day. Yeah, so the training, I think, really is very relevant to any community that's looking to do resilience planning. The only thing that's extremely coastally centric is the underlying mapped data that looks specifically at coastal hazards. Although we do also talk about high heat or extreme temperature hazards, and also changes in rainfall patterns with climate change. So, and those aren't just limited to coastal, but I think really, I mean, Jeanne, and I think you would agree, it's extremely relevant.
I actually think the training transcends just resilience planning in general. It's really kind of best practices, I think, for community-based work that engages marginalized populations, quite frankly. And so I think to that extent, we learned a tremendous amount. And I mean, just 2 hours ago, I was emailing some colleagues on a project regarding planning for health, improving health in a community. And I cut and paste some things from the training. So yeah, it can, I think there's a lot there. It's pretty, it's not going to hurt your brain to go through the training. So I encourage you to go through it. It's not a heavy lift, but we hope that it spurs your thinking.
Jeanne, I'll just note that early on in the webinar, we had a question from Mary B, and it was specific to our second slide, that great infographic that talks about the vulnerable populations, and she was wondering if that was available publicly, but I need to defer to you on that one.
Yeah, I stole it from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So
No, you borrowed it.
I borrowed
like
it.
we all do. And again, to point out that Jeanne and Lisa have graciously agreed to share their slides. So again, that will be on our webpage. So I guess let your conscience be your guide.
I noticed another question from Kelly Flicka, one of our colleagues at FEMA. And
Kelly's not allowed to have any questions, Lisa.
Kelly's got a lot of questions.
She should know all about this.
Well, Kelly was one of our early project managers on this project, so I'd love to give her a little shout out for that.
Absolutely.
But in addition to that, and actually another participant, Lisa Avichel, is also worked on this project in its early days. So another shout out there as well. So Kelly, next steps for this work, I can start, and Jeanne, I'd punt to you as well. We are really interested in, and as is the original funding agency, to take some of what we've done in New Jersey and transfer it nationally, so that climate resilience practitioners throughout the nation are benefiting from the work we've started here in New Jersey and from some of these best practices. So we are in conversations with our colleagues at NOAA about you know, even beefing up the training to some level, kind of giving it a few more whistles and bells and make it a little more exciting to go through. But that's one of the next steps. And then, of course, we hope that the policy recommendations we made in the report lay out a nice set of next steps. Jeanne, I'll defer to you for anything additional.
Yeah, and I think I would also add is, so when we talk about data, maybe we'll get a tiny bit more specific. So the data, it's fancy, right? The data visualization and mapping platforms that Rutgers has developed, think of them as mapping tools, NJ Flood Mapper. They give you access to data in your community about who are the populations that are most vulnerable, but also other things like infrastructure, evacuation routes, hospitals, fire stations, hazardous waste sites. And then they also allow you to overlay that data with climate data. So what does my community look like in 3 feet of sea level rise, right? So what we heard from our project working group as part of this project was that we really needed to beef up the kind of data that would help communities to plan for the most vulnerable populations. And so to that extent, for example, we incorporated data from the United Way's ALICE database, the Asset Limited Employed Income Constrained database, which is about families, data about families that are working but still can't cut and pay, right? So that's different than poverty. So now you have access to that. There's access to data about race and income and access to a vehicle, or people who live in, who are limited English proficient. So now there's access to that. And then the other thing that we were able to do, and I don't know if this is live yet, Lisa, but we've created these municipal, automated municipal snapshots. So you're able to go on the tool and say, I live in so-and-so town, and tell me about social vulnerability in my town, and it'll just print that out for you. So that's a terrific planning tool. But the reason I wanted to bring that up is if you want to be on our email list, we can keep you in the loop as that data continues to improve. We're constantly improving. And in fact, we actually just received some funding to add more health data into the tools, and we'll be looking for some end users like yourselves. So we'll work through Keith and Linda to reach out to see if any of you want to give us input on what other data would be helpful for you to have on those tools. So you're welcome to put in the chat box, or our emails are here. You can email and we'll sign you up on our list, and then we'll know how to find you all.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Beth Olson, so you can unmute yourself.
Hi. Oops. Hang on a second here.
Hi, Beth.
Hi. I'm curious if you have some, like maybe an example of a good success story, or maybe you can send me to a link for some real specific training. I've had difficulty when I do resilience planning, so pre-disaster stuff, and I go into vulnerable communities. And I know how to go through looking for the local organizations, like the key people in the community. But the problem I found is that, let's say it's a community and they are definitely underserved overall, low income, or people of color. And so I get those people in the room, or any other variety of an underserved, multi-factored community. But I have never been able to get those that are non-English speakers or even multilingual people to come to the meetings. So my question is, or the training I could use is, when you go into a community where the local organizers are not part of that group, and that group is just a tiny part of the community, they're there because of the Census Bureau says they're there. How would I learn how to find or attract those people when the main organizing groups are not the way to go?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you. And that really gets to the heart of the project, I think. So there's lots of answers to it. I think I want to make sure everyone doesn't lose sight of the state policy recommendations that also came to this report, because those also, in addition to the community-based work, speak to that. So for example, we offer policy recommendations that say, okay, state of New Jersey, if you're going to provide a grant to the community that Beth works in to do resilience, let's make sure that Beth's organization gets a little bit of that money too. And let's also, if we're going to be asking representatives of underrepresented populations to consult on this, maybe they need to be compensated. Because just like you would consult with an engineer or a wetland specialist as part of your resilience planning and they get paid, then maybe that compensation needs to be part of this. Some of the other recommendations in terms of the community-based work is ensuring that sometimes you can't get to everyone. And let's keep in mind that for most of these most vulnerable populations, they have a lot on their plate, and probably a lot more now during COVID than before. And so in those situations, or they may be undocumented immigrants, and they're not going to come to your big public meeting, right? So you're going to need to be able to work with the organizations that represent them, some of which are NJVOED organizations, which may be faith-based organizations, which may be the food pantry. And again, ensuring that those organizations have the capacity and resources they need to participate in the conversation. Some of the other things that we offer, both in terms of the policy recommendations and in terms of the community-based work, is that the way that climate resilience planners often work is, we have our meetings at certain times of the day that might not be very convenient. We don't have translators there. They're not necessarily, culturally relevant for the people that we're inviting to the meeting. We don't have babysitters. We don't have cars to get people to meetings if they can't get there. So we offer a number of thoughts to, sort of go through in planning to really try to reduce some of those barriers. So I encourage you, Beth, to take the training and let us know if it's helpful. Lisa, I see you went off mute. Do you have something to add?
I was just going to say, Beth, that I think your strategy, the best practice you're already using, is to use a local group as your liaison or your bridge to get to the groups you're attempting to reach. I think my only other advice beyond what Jeanne said would be to look towards faith-based organizations for a non-English speaking community. I know in my little small town I live in, it's our faith-based organizations that have really figured that out extremely well, with offering services in different languages and special services at different times. So that might be a way in that you might want to look at.
Yeah, I think another
Yeah.
great contact in your community is your public health officer.
Yeah, and Beth and I certainly would encourage you to reach out to me as well. Oftentimes we have connections through our COAD networks and affiliates, and many of those groups we are connected with. So this is all about like building relationships. So you already get the idea of the trusted agent, but sometimes that trusted agent is so small, they're not even on the town's radar. But we constantly are building those networks of relationships every day, and we'd love to have you be a part of that.
Well, thanks. And as a matter of fact, actually, as all of you were giving me ideas, one came to mind because I've gone to the faith-based, but of course, and I do know communities, there are some communities where the faith-based organizations would get to the non-English speakers. But then I also thought maybe the problem is I'm the one going in there looking for them. Maybe I need to get, for instance, a friend of mine who is Puerto Rican and have her, I can give her the script and she goes in because she's going to have well, first of all, she has the dual language. So if somebody walks by that she thinks speaks, Spanish in this case, she can immediately talk to them, and that might just simply, my barriers might be there because I don't speak the other languages and I don't look like a person that speaks
That's right.
their language. And so that gives me some ideas. I think I'm going to try, all of your ideas, but
Yay.
that one I think would be also one to add to my bin of tools.
That's great. Thanks.
And the other thing that I would say to you, Beth, in that regard is the message itself.
Yeah.
So oftentimes our vulnerable communities are basically focused on surviving. So all those things, food, insecurity, working two jobs, all the schedule issues that my colleagues talked about.
Yeah.
But sometimes we go in and we say, I know in, kind of my previous, when I first started in the VOAD movement, they would say, oh, you're the disaster guy. And I would say, no, I'm a community developer with a focus on disaster. And I think it's a different thing. And we've certainly been messaging that as New Jersey VOAD is a much broader scope. So we know, and you just heard this in the Marvel's presentation, but disasters occur in context, right? So, some people are kind of already in disaster in the community prior to the big disaster. Some people are just barely hanging on. So I think sometimes to get their attention, you need to be talking about, this is about building community connections that not only are useful in a Sandy or a pandemic, but these are things that are useful connections for people's everyday lives and can improve their health and their happiness within their community. And I think that's the message that most resounds with them.
Well, thank you all. You have actually helped me.
Good.
Thanks, Beth. I believe that is all the questions that we have. So Keith, I'll turn it back over to you to close us
Sure.
out.
So I'll just kind of continue on with my last spiel. But I do want to say that early on, as we engaged with, our speakers today and the broader Climate Change Alliance and others, we're now involved with the RISE project for Waterfront Alliance up in New York City. So we've been very involved in climate change. And early on, somebody came to me and said, well, we're about responding to disasters and doing disaster recovery, and why should we be involved in climate change? Well, my answer kind of was duh. And as you can take away from the presentation today, if we believe in building community resilience, and actually, Jeanne, I disagree, we have exactly the same definitions. We're coming at it from different angles. But it is imperative that we're all working together on this. So no matter what piece, and certainly we had folks from the government involved in this project, and we had folks that were our clients who were involved in this project, and we also had folks from environmental justice, which provide a different perspective. So I really think as we come together from different communities, different experiences, different cultures, it is so important, and I love the title, Making a Seat at the Table, because really it is about kind of building these relationships, finding the assets in our communities, and connecting them together to build resilience. So I thank you all for being here and being a part of our webinar today. Jeanne, Lisa, thanks. Great job, as always. And if there's nothing else, I will bid you a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
And as I already tell folks, is to be smart, to be safe, and to be kind.
Yeah.
Take care. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.